we know from the records that when still a fairly young king, Henry Tudor, Henry VIII, was in chapel one day assisting at the sacred mysteries, which, remember, he had defended, and for which, by the Pope himself, he'd been given the title of Fidei Defensor, which is still on the English penny. He already at that point was starting to misbehave, and this preacher, who was a fearless Franciscan, preached on the passage that we have just had with regard to what came back to roost in the life of Ahab, king of Israel, who brought Israel into sin because, essentially, of his involvement with Jezebel, his Canaanite wife, who was contaminating the faith of Israel. This fearless Franciscan, in no uncertain terms, lashed out and warned the king in a way which was not just human, perhaps, but divinely inspired, that this one day would be his end if he carried on in the way that he was starting to behave. Down the line, after the famous break with Rome, which was the opening, basically, of the doors also to heresy, because Rome was the one solid point that kept that from happening in the midst of the tidal wave of error coming from Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and the like. When he, therefore, was at his sixth wife, and at that time overweight and petering out, having sent to glory the likes of the Carthusian martyrs, Thomas More, John Fisher, and the beginnings of the long army of martyrs of Tyburn, of which we have the last, Oliver Plunkett, much later in time, 1681. Again, initially because of a question of the wife, because he needed a male heir to keep this new lineage of the Tudors intact, and it wasn't happening. The true queen, Catherine of Aragon, a fervent Catholic, did produce a daughter, but only a daughter. Eventually, Anne Boleyn did produce Elizabeth, but it wasn't what he wanted. It was only Jane Seymour who produced Edward. And it was Edward, of course, who was going to be the open door to big-time Protestantism coming in. Why? He was only a child. So it was handed over to Latimer and Ridley to do the work for him, and they took advantage of the situation to bring in a radical form of Protestantism from the continent. He had tuberculosis and died at the age of 15. And only then did Mary Tudor come back, but didn't live long. One wonders what happened. Only from 1553 to 1558, what happened? Question mark that history has never resolved. And then we had Elizabeth, and we know the consequences. But this bit people don't know. Henry VIII, of course, was the one that was going to make that all possible. And when it came to his death, we have the verdict of, I remember an author that I was studying in France when looking at our own history, because we produced the first martyrs essentially, the Carthusians. It was very interesting that the whole case of Henry was analysed, and it calmly says, asking the question, did he find the Lord at his death? And this author, who was a good historian, a Catholic, calmly answers in this vein. Of course one can't reply, only God can. But he does indicate this, that the problem all along, in the case of Henry, from the moment he started to go down, was this one, the abuse of grace. Now that theologically is a profound statement, and it applies to each of us. Things start to go wrong when grace is abused. And he goes into some detail to explain his point, that he will be receiving Holy Communion even when already living in sin with Anne Boleyn and the like. Eventually, what happened? He was, of course, to be given a king's funeral, but something went wrong. His body had to be taken a certain journey to this resting place, and it involved actually a night in a chapel. At that point, something unexpected happened. His bloated body simply burst, and out of it oozed a ghastly liquid, blood and other stuff, and in that situation there was a smelly presence which repelled people, therefore left him very much isolated in his last hours on earth, in the body, I mean, after his death. And the dogs came in and licked this liquid in such a way that this prophecy made some years earlier by the Franciscan came true, literally. Of course, we don't know what his eternal fate was. I did hear somewhere that actually he's in purgatory until the end of time. I hope it's true rather than the other place, but that's one of the mysteries of providence. I make a jump. In the Carthusian order, there were stories handed on from father to son, and we know they're true because within an order like that things come down and they're fairly dependable, once certainly put in writing. And we know what was going on in the London Charter House when they were being forced to sign these documents. They, being contemplatives, were fully aware of what was at stake, more than most people, including the bishops. Only John Fisher stood out. They initially were going to make the last sacrifice even for the first wave, which would have involved the act of succession. But then they were told by experts it's not worth it. That actually could be within the king's will. But then it went further, when the likes of the act of supremacy came in, when actually you're coming into dogma. There's no way the king can be head of a church. And so it started. The three priors were together in the London Charter House to confer, and the authorities zoomed in. They were taken, and along with John Reynolds of Bridgetine, were the first to shed their blood. They were taken on a hurdle through the bumpy roads of London. That means carted behind horses on this thing which had no wheels. And as they went, St. Thomas More, who was already in the Tower of London, having served his king so well, and he said to his daughter Meg, as they peered through the niche in the tower, "Look how they go, like bridegrooms to the wedding feast." And soon after, Thomas More and John Fisher would be in the same place. However, because Thomas More was the king's friend, a special favour was granted to him. That simply of being beheaded, to which he replied, "May the Lord preserve the king's friends from such favours." And he, as he went to the block, invited his executioner Look unto thy reputation, good sir, for my neck is short, and my beard has done none harm. So he went, with a twinkle of British wit, unto glory, while Henry eventually spent his life destroying monasteries and churches. All because Rome would not meddle with the sacrament of holy matrimony, and Rome must still not meddle with the sacrament of holy matrimony. This day is the feast of St. Romuald, therefore we're still in the ambit of the powerful eremitic movement of which the Carthusians were the French equivalent. It was the first great reform of those who were going to wear white. It started already in 981 when St. Romuald was starting to make his foundations. He sought always solitude and would seek out remote areas, and he would always have this specificity to make within the enclosure an enclosure which was even more enclosed and offer the possibility of reclusion. He, after a while, would always opt for that in his own case if possible, and on it went. Now, as it happens, in Selignac, our monastery, when I was formed as a Carthusian, my novice master who had entered way before the war, actually, 1936, with other young men, was a saint, and he would have known the giants that formed us, because our monastery had been opened already much earlier than the Grand Chartreuse after the expulsion. In 1926 already it was already open, whereas the Grand Chartreuse only came back during the war in secret. And when they reopened it, it was going to be a model monastery. That's what they wanted. And all the stuff that had gone on before the expulsion was going to stop. No retreats, no contact with the world at all. And Don Maurice Buchanan was a holy man and meant business. So they were the ones who'd been formed before us and were forming us. And we knew what they meant when they meant the absolute. It was a whole school of thought which had been handed on. So there they were. And our own Don Martin was one of the few who received internal canonization. It's the system in the order where they have a unanimous vote from all who have known him that he was actually a saint. And they have this then, he lived in the order for so many years faithfully. Laudabiliter vixit, tot annis in ordine. So he had it, but these were all together. Don Martin, who became prior, my novice master, who was a holy man, and then this other one, Dom Damien. Damien, of course, was Camaldolese, Peter Damien, who was at Voltiano Avellano and became eventually bishop and cardinal. Now, I want to zoom in for a minute to two of these, and I'll tell you why at the end. First of all, Don Martin. He entered at 17, never spoke, hardly. He became prior, and he was still completely silent. He would only speak when there was real necessity. And they knew that when he celebrated, he was extremely close to the angels. Why? They could see his face shining, and it was something different. They knew this man was different. Everything he did perfectly well. He never wasted a word. He was in complete linear movement of contemplation. Eventually, he asked not to be prior any longer, and he was made chaplain to the Carthusian nuns at Norainc. One day, when he was still only in his 60s, the superior found this note. I know that today the Lord is coming for me, and I leave you my testament. It was just one sentence. Le saint silence est le secret de la vie intérieure. Holy silence is the secret of the interior life. That meant that he knew that he was going to die that day, even though there was no sign of illness, and he wanted to say what mattered in one note. Immediately he was put to the vote for all those who had known him, and he got this Slagability Ritzigt. And we were given to understand that this meant a lot, because in it was the whole interior life summed up on one small note. All the rest can wait. If one is wasting and leaking energy in the monastic life, there's no point in entering. All is there to lead to what the gospel today talks about being perfect. All energy goes towards God. And if a monastery ceases to do that, it loses its raison d'être and will not get vocations. Why? They can do more elsewhere. The other is Don Damien. He had been, for about 12 years, a missionary, and he even knew how to fly an aeroplane on the mission field. He felt called to contemplation, and with permission, he left. I think he had been a Redemptorist, and entered the Carthusian life in our monastery, at the same time as our own novice master when he was a young man. He also took it extremely seriously, and one day he was asked if he would go to become procurator in another monastery, the big one in Florence, La Certosa, which would have meant a lot of interaction with the world. Out of obedience he went there physically, but got to the outside of the enclosure, and before going into it asked if he could stay just where he was, I think in the guest house part before he went right in, and see if it was possible to go to nearby Camaldoli to become a recluse. Now that's why I'm bringing it in today, because St. Romulus, whom we're feasting, is the founder of Camaldoli. And it's the order that still allows reclusion. And puzzlingly enough, he obtained all the permissions. And he persevered in reclusion until death, which was in 1960. After him, Dom Stefano took the cell over, but didn't persevere in reclusion. There are still one or two since then in other houses, notably the colony's reform. And it hit me because I felt the call to replace him. And that's eventually what happened, in the sense that that temptation, or whatever you want to call it, was what made me unstable. Because actually when I got there, I found they had changed their charism, and they had become very involved with the world. And sadly, the Camaldolis of the great family, not the reform, has lost to some extent the cutting edge. Rather sad. There is one other case I want to refer to. It's the surprise I had when I got to Rome. A couple of things happened there. Things hadn't worked out, and the same Dom Simeon, my novice master, at that point was petering out in the monastery back in France. And I was still in contact with my monastery, even though I'd been transferred to the Norbertines. And I sent a letter to Don Justin, who had taught me theology and been my confessor, and was nursing him. And I said, "He's dying. Could you please give him this message? Don David wants to become a priest, not getting there. Can you get me there, Don Simeon, when you die and see Jesus?" So he waited for a moment when novice master, just about to die, came back to a moment of lucidity, because there were intermittent moments when he could talk and communicate again intelligently. And the letter that came back was this: I got him in a moment of lucidity, et c'était son dernier joie pastorale. And it was his last pastoral joy, that message from me. Because I entered 22, 23, very young, and he remembered me well. And very shortly after, it seemed that all the bolted doors were unlocked, and I was ordained. It just happened. So people who go like rockets into glory have power when they get there. Send messages with your departing brethren if they're in a state of grace. But this one then, about the same time happened, I found myself living close to another, by then recently deceased recluse, which I didn't know about. Because the Camaldoli still had the possibility, a certain young lady called Giulia Crotti, in Italian, eventually asked if she could become a recluse of the most austere manner in Rome itself, in the heart of Rome, in the Camaldolese monastery on the Aventine, close to where we were living. Her cell is still there. She lived a life of a complete victim. She slept on a stone cross on the ground. She never ever let anyone see her face in her tiny cell, which is in the heart of the enclosure of the monastery. Even her confessor never saw her. They always spoke through a veiled grille. She ate hardly a thing, essentially bread and water. She just created suffering all day and all night as a pure victim soul. She had words for the church through her spiritual director, a Camaldolese from the nearby Camaldoli monastery, San Gregorio, and warned that the Lord did not want the monastic world to lose its identity. And she was specific. Clear warning as the council was about to unfold and to make things unhappy. Not because of what the Holy Spirit was saying to the church and the council, but of the manipulation of the same by men who didn't realize what was going on and how old Nick could mess things up. She was visited by no less than 3 popes, none of which would ever see her face. And then she petered out, I think in the 90s. Now we know from several communications that terrible things were impending on mankind in recent times, but hitherto they have been averted by one thing in particular: victim souls. The amount of suffering that Padre Pio took on himself is indescribable. One time, an English friend of his offered to take upon himself some of it, and he allowed him. But so atrocious and unbearable was the pain after only a few seconds that he couldn't take it anymore and asked it to be taken away. So this was the continual state of victimhood of Padre Pio. And these hidden souls are dotted around the Catholic Church still. And also, until recently, the contemplative life had that role of being a counterbalance and of taking on voluntary penance on behalf of mankind. So in the interests of who is it that should massively not happen anymore? That in its place should take place not the watching of the tabernacle, but the goggle box. That silence should give way to perpetual recreation, even at work. Do you see how old Nick is clever? So bring down the monastic world, which is the heart of the church, as Teresa of Lisieux said, in the heart of my mother the church I will be love. You have a victory for the very ones who want to destroy mankind. So let's remember that, because what happened? Our Lady came back, not only at Medjugorje, but way before, to ask for the same thing: penance, penance, penance. And if she's saying that from on high, there's a reason for it. And what were the children already shown, not only at Medjugorje, but also at Fatima, but the place where sinners go, because no one prays for them and makes the sacrifices.